Thank you, Alyssa. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Leah Forney. I am the Underserved Populations Policy Advocate here at MCASA. And I just want to read our expert trainer, Theron's bio real quick. So Theron Giovanni is an independently licensed clinical social worker who specializes in working with queer and gender expansive youth and young adults. His clinical interests include advocacy for youth and their families, working with trauma, and substance use, and supporting other clinicians in providing affirming care. Theron approaches clinical work through psychodynamic theories, third wave cognitive behavioral approaches, harm reduction, and relational cultural frameworks, while also addressing intersectionality and examining systems of oppression, privilege, and power. Darren earned his MSW from the Smith College School of Social Work and has been practicing clinical social work for the last decade as a supervisor, therapist, and consultant. He has previously worked with youth and young adults in various capacities on programs focused on LGBTQ issues, including houselessness, commercial sexual exploitation, sexual health, substance use, and trauma. He is currently a social work PhD student at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Theron.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Sometimes I hear that introduction in bio and I'm like, who is that person? But yes, it is me. Well, let me welcome you. I'm very excited to be here today. I appreciate and want to thank MCASA for the invitation to come and give a training about a very near and dear topic to my heart. I am also, if I pause, I'm working on speaking slowly to ensure that I can communicate with everyone in the audience and I'm heard very clear. I would also invite you to please mention anything in the chat. I've asked for assistance in making sure that comments are monitored. We will also ask that you put any questions in the Q&A. I am a trainer that really likes to invite the expertise of the audience. As much as I am sharing information with you, I also believe that I can learn something from you as well, and we can all learn something from each other. So comments in the chat and questions in the Q&A. And I'm already going to pause because I see someone has a hand raised, so I want to make sure there's no technical issues. And perhaps that was an accident, but okay. I believe I see the name Aaron. Are you able to come off mute? Okay, I'm going to make an assumption that that might be an accident. But with that, I will acknowledge you. So if you could raise your hand or anything, question, comments in the box, I want to make sure that we can all share with each other and learn from each other. So let me, with that, move on to our objectives. So my hope today, and I always feel like this is sort of a grand agenda, but I want to examine some of the issues and barriers that heighten risk and vulnerabilities and to trafficking. I also want to say maybe susceptibility to trafficking. We'll identify some structural and systemic challenges that impact cases and clinical work. We will also discuss some steps in order to provide what I call a unique response to LGBTQ plus, queer and gender diverse individuals, where we can advocate for meaningful resources and support and promote resiliency. And then on the back end, I'd like to spend some time talking about how we can share some strategies so that you can sustain your own self-awareness and compassion while doing this work. It can be heavy at times, and I'm aware just, practicing clinical work today has maybe a different feeling than it might have before, whether that's due to pandemic or other socio-political climate issues. But I want to make sure we spend some time just identifying how we might support ourselves in the work, seeking consultation, and just how we do and manage when we're doing trafficking work. And then I want to ask, in general, I do this with all my trainings, like what would support you? What do you think supports you and your work when you consider risk and resiliency in particular with this population? And here I want to put a plug in, as I've already said the word. So I am mindful that queer is a word that can be triggering or targeting. And here's where I might say much of my training and clinical work has been with youth and young adults, and I tend to adapt the language of how they identify themselves. And so I'm aware that queer is perhaps a word in uh, language and identity today that feels very different maybe than what it was, let's say, even 10, 20, 30 years ago. So you may hear me say that. I will often use the word gender diverse as well. And what I intend by that is just to encompass those who identify as transgender, gender non-binary, gender queer, or differently gender expressed individuals. And just for the sake of brevity, I tend to use gender diverse, I tend to use queer. It's not perfect, but I want to offer that to you today. And I want to just share a little bit about sort of where I come from and my thinking in line as I am a practitioner. I'm also a budding researcher. So I want to offer you what I feel like is my lens and experience in terms of doing this work. And so we talk about it, or I talk about it as positionality, my perspective, my epistemological identity. So I tend to bring a lot of lived experience and professional experience to this work. I identify with this community professionally. I have worked with this community. I have been trained in Massachusetts, Georgia, now here and in California. So I also hope that I can bring a multi-regional perspective. I do see some overlap in the work, but I also want to make sure I share from my experiences from previous places. And so that will be multi-regional and a little bit, I hesitate to call it national, but more just some places in different areas of the US. As stated before, I'm independently licensed, and I tend to think about my experience as a social worker through the three systems lenses. So at the micro level, I've practiced clinical therapy in community-based residential college counseling settings. I have a little bit of time in private practice, but much of it was spent in the community. Right now, I do a lot of supervision, a lot of consultation. I provide consultation to actually a program in Boston, Massachusetts still. And these programs for young people tend to have a stream of local funding, sometimes federal, but it mostly stems around public health issues, sexual health, things of that nature. And right now, I spend a lot of time reading and writing and researching. I am heavily invested in how we come to know things in science, and particularly how we understand marginalized and populations that have been ostracized from traditional mainstream research. And so my process with theory is I'm very interested in how we come to know things because it does inform how we practice. So that's a little bit about me. I'm currently a PhD student studying in, again, my interests align with LGBT plus identities, and also looking at right now the gender affirming care bans and impact on the community. All right, so let's get into the nitty gritty. If you see me looking off to the side, it's because I'm presenting on one screen and I've got my notes on another screen. So just so we are on the same page about definitions and how we are thinking about trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation, I just want to offer some of the definitions that my slide deck will use and work from. So when I am thinking about human trafficking, and this is directly, I'm sure some of you are involved with the Maryland Human Trafficking Task Force, but we're talking about the illegal trading nationally or internationally of human beings for the purposes of commercial sexual exploitation or forced labor. So what we know is that this is a very fast growing industry. It's been a problem long before I was even in training and even thinking about it. And I think now we are maybe perhaps it's a little more present. And I'm aware because maybe there are some cases right now currently. I think about P. Diddy, I think about Jeffrey Epstein, some of the more famous names, R. Kelly, that have been in the press as of lately. And I also want to be mindful that trafficking does not always look like what is shared on the news or what comes through the outlets. And so I want to be cautious that even, perhaps as we're walking down the street, that there is a very real presence of trafficking and exploitative behavior around us. And so at the federal level, human trafficking offenses are defined, and these are federal statutes that include peonage, slavery, forced labor, sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, and other abuses of children. We are also talking about the transportation for illegal sexual activity and related crimes. Again, I want to be aware that sometimes there is a difference in what is federally acknowledged and then also what happens at the local and state level jurisdiction. From my experience too, having practiced in California, to Georgia, to Massachusetts, and now here, I'm also aware of the different conversations and different laws, perhaps, and bills that have come about, laws that have come into place. There's a difference in terms of maybe how local jurisdictions look at this too. And I think sometimes what can happen is it might be based on numbers, but I believe that trafficking is everywhere. It happens everywhere. And I'm hopeful one day that we will have all states that have some sense of commonality among how they view this issue, and perhaps that the federal and local state jurisdiction also might have, laws in place that will be similar. Now kind of turning to commercial sexual exploitation. And I'm going to talk about this sort of in the way that I was trained. So when I first started doing much of this work, I was working with young people. It was from that lens of commercial sexual exploitation of children. And so there are really three key points to point out, but we're talking about any situation in which a minor performs a sexual act and is exploited sexually through force, coercion, and or fraud in exchange for something of value, a promise or a need or a financial gain. And so three things that I tend to hone in on is that there's an exchange of something. and it is not always money. That is very important to note, especially in terms of the LGBTQ plus population. There also might be third party involvement, but that is not necessarily always true. And that was absolutely, anecdotally speaking, a lot across my caseload was, in fact, it was highly likely that there wasn't a third party involved. And then the last thing is that these sexual acts are not always overt. So I think sometimes because of the media, what we see in movies or what we might read in books, that for something to be terrible, it has to be overt and blatantly seen. And I think unfortunately this is a lot where young people in particular can fall through the cracks because they might be talking about something like stripping that isn't necessarily um, as overt. And so I think about, some of the younger clinicians that I supervise, they would hear sort of these stories and I say, well, what else are you asking so that you might find out more? And sometimes they weren't always noting the small things that were happening in the case. And so in Georgia, CSEC, which I'll shorten, is a form of violence and child abuse. And to my knowledge, in doing my due diligence and research, I understand in Maryland, human trafficking and child pornography are also considered child abuse and must be reported. I will share that in Georgia, this is fairly, well, at this point, at the time that I was starting these presentations, it was fairly recent that the state and what Georgia calls their child welfare system, it was fairly new that CSEC became a form of child abuse. So this was about 10, 12 years ago. So I realize now sharing that statement, we're adding on 10 years. So I'm hopeful that their work is getting stronger. I also would like to make a note that we might hear domestic minor sex trafficking or DMST. And this really came about because there was a lot of feedback that, in the US, I'll speak from learning this in Georgia. In Georgia, we don't have sexual exploitation, we don't have human trafficking. And so it was important that we were drawing attention to the issues that were happening. And so the term domestic minor sex trafficking kind of grew out of bringing a stronger awareness to the issues and the things that were going on in the US domestically, right in front of our eyes. All right. So I acknowledged this a moment ago. I first gave a version of this presentation roughly about 10 years ago. And as I was putting this together for today, I became really curious about the statistics and the research that I shared 10 years ago. I wanted to see how it was holding up in 2023, 2024. So I purposely, you're not seeing a new slide deck. What I actually did was take the exact same slide that I used about 10 years ago. And I wanted to do some research and to see how these stats held up with research, how things were going. So I've plucked the slide here and I actually want to kind of entertain sort of what's been going on lately. So I want you to think about this was roughly about 10 years ago. Okay. And some of this you might know or you might have heard, but between 20 and 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT. And this is from a study I guess a long while ago now in 2006. And what it was is actually it's sort of an analysis of quite a few studies looking at unaccompanied homeless youth and asking about demographics and identity. And you'll see this range 20 to 40% because it really depends on sort of the density of that area, the population density. So if it's more rural, it might not be as high. So we have offered this range to kind of give perspective of the US respectively in terms of rural, urban, suburban. And so interestingly enough, in a study, gender minority youth experiencing homelessness and corresponding health disparities, researchers found that 22% of gender minority youth reported homelessness when compared to 3% of cisgender counterparts. And when I say cisgender, I mean those individuals who do not identify as gender diverse. So they are not transgender. They're identifying as the sex they were assigned at birth. And so, interestingly enough, it's clear 10 years later, we're looking at this stat and it's holding up. And what we also know today is trans youth were significantly more likely to also report living on the street, also when compared to cis counterparts. And I think it's important to acknowledge here that cisgender youth, other cisgender unaccompanied youth may have access to shelters in a way that transgender youth do not. So when we think about sort of a traditional shelter, sometimes they're gendered, right? This is a women's shelter or this is a men's shelter. Or when individuals go into even a co-ed shelter, there's still some delineation on the gender binary with regards to that shelter. So that automatically is going to exclude any unaccompanied or houseless gender diverse young person, especially if they don't want to report, acknowledge, share, disclose, or don't feel comfortable electing which side to be on. And I just want to pause here. I'm going to glance at the chat, just make sure. Yeah. As I share some of these stats, I expect there might be some comments about it, and I want to encourage you to ask questions as needed. And I also actually want to point out here too, so this was the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey. And so what it was is it's actually high school youth that take this survey. I've mentioned the states that elected to ask the question about gender identity. So this is how youth reported homelessness based on their gender identity. And I want to be clear, not all states chose to ask this question. Do you identify as transgender? This is very new. It started in 2019, and right now there are only 11 states that elect to report on gender identity. So only these 11 states are represented in this statistic. So about 46% of LGBTQ youth reported running away because of some type of family rejection or conflict based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. Again, we're looking at roughish 10 years ago. This was a report, again, around experiences of LGBTQ plus experiencing homelessness. So let's look at how this holds up today. And so I actually did a lot of digging. I was actually looking for any research in the last few years. And the most recent literature I found was actually 2018, and there was another study in 2016 that I'll mention later. But I couldn't get into 2020 and beyond. But this is actually this researcher their name pops up a lot in the literature on youth homelessness. So this was a chapter in a book on human trafficking and social work practice. And the chapter was titled Sex Trafficking and Exploitation of LGBTQ plus Youth. And so what they noted is that these young folks involved in sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation were still reporting a fair amount of family conflict, parental rejection, in addition to bullying and discrimination that resulted in running away. And what we know is that this is a potential pathway. I won't say it's it's not causal. And I want to be careful that we're not implying causation here because someone's running away, they are sexually exploited. What we know is there's a strong correlation. But this provides a pathway. Running behaviors provides a pathway into commercial sex involvement and potential survival sex. And in particular with adults, discrimination in healthcare, employment, and housing can impact commercial sex involvement. And so again, roughly about 10 years ago, we had identified that there was a great majority of CSEC youth reporting prior systems involvement. And so what I mean by that is the systems included child welfare systems, either through screening and investigation of cases around child abuse, emotional abuse, or neglect, or foster care placements. And I will also mention the juvenile justice systems as well. And so let's see how this holds up to today. So this was a very interesting recent report that looked at a lot of studies. And what they note in particular is that there is a very, very large overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous, LGBTQ youth of color represented in the foster care system. My partner actually worked previously in adoptions and foster care. And we talk about this a lot, just sort of, the number of cases and situations she had where there was just majority young people of color over-identified in these systems. And so anecdotally speaking too, noting this in my work, running away from a system was actually a better option. And I want to kind of break this down a little bit because, one would think you're running away from, support, you've got advocacy, you've got a caseworker, you've got XYZ things, right, that might be helping you. And what young people would actually share a lot with me was like, well, the system's not really helping. I'm in a foster care placement where I have a foster parent who is not supporting me wearing and expressing my gender in this way. I felt more safe in the home that I was placed out of than I feel, with this foster placement. And so they spoke a lot about discrimination that they felt, a lot of bias that they felt. And even despite the risk of being homeless or houseless, that felt like a viable option. Rather than staying in a system that they felt was just perpetuating a lot of the mistreatment and concern. And so it's interesting to sort of, again, kind of continue this conversation. As I've shared, it's been, nearly a decade that I've been working, in various roles with this population, and the same consistent information that is shared. All right. And so we've got homeless LGBTQ youth are 7 to 8 times more likely to trade sex for daily essentials and engage in commercial sex due to the lack of resources and services when compared to non-LGBTQ counterparts. Let's see how we hold up today. And so this is actually uh, two studies that use the same measures. So it's the Youth Experiences Survey. One study is looking at Kentucky and Indiana. In fact, it was written as Kentuckiana. And the other study is actually in Arizona. And to be clear, the team at Arizona composed this measure. And so what I understand and seeing through some of the literature, the Youth Experiences Survey is one of the predominant measures when given to homeless young people. And actually does a good job of tracking gender identity and sexuality as well. So we got two studies. I purposely shared them because we're talking about different locations in the US. And I want you to note some of the parallels between these statistics, if you will. So in Arizona, over a third of those individuals reported, so young people in the study reported sex trafficking. Of those 30%, half of them identified as LGBTQ youth. So again, picking up on that over-representation of homeless youth, they're more likely to identify as LGBTQ. Additionally, the LGBTQ young people who reported sex trafficking were also found to significantly report more exchanging sex for money. They also reported higher rates of suicide attempts, drug use, risk-taking behaviors, as well as a history of sexual and physical abuse. And then the odds of being LGBTQ and sex trafficked were actually 2 times higher than just those experiences reported among heterosexual and sex trafficked. And so in Kentucky and Indiana, we've got roughly 40% of those homeless individuals reporting sex trafficking. They were also more likely to report previous self-harm behaviors, suicide attempts, and substance use. And then nearly 30% of those respondents who reported sex trafficking experience also reported being sex trafficked by a person who either encouraged, pressured, or forced them to exchange sexual acts for money, drugs, protection, a place to stay, or clothing. Okay. So there's some parallels here. I don't mean to overshare on the statistics, but what I want to draw out is that this issue is not isolated to any one area in the US. I want to point out that this is an issue nationally. It is a US issue, and it's happening across the states. And the experience of sex trafficking is pretty consistent among the LGBTQ young people identified in these reports. So here I want to move on, if you will, to a rationale as to why it's important to examine the intersections of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, however you want to call it, DMST, and LGBTQ plus, queer, and gender diverse identities, right? We know that there's a high prevalence and an increased risk for LGBTQ individuals and their susceptibility to, I'm just going to use human trafficking broadly, okay? I also noted additionally in the research that I'll say this is an understudied issue. I think we've established that there's a prevalence. However, as we see in the 10 years, I'm sitting with you today talking about this, we see 10 years ago, right, that these statistics are still holding up. And they're, interestingly enough, in the research that I was examining for today, they cited the very same studies that I cited in 2015 in my original presentation. So there's a gap, maybe particularly, especially, I should say, when we're talking about trans, non-binary, and gender diverse individuals. Because as you know, like I said, in the Yerbis study, the youth risk behavior study, um, they hadn't always asked the question around gender identity. And so as gender has evolved today, the research has also got to track and evolve as well. So we've definitely got to make sure that we're capturing the experiences in particular among trans, non-binary, and gender diverse folks, because there's a significant gap. Furthermore, the study that I've cited at the bottom, which actually, it was a qualitative study where they asked social service providers about their experiences in working with LGBTQ plus individuals who were at risk of sex trafficking. And what this study actually pointed out is that much of the training and the information that was given to the social service providers in order to provide some type of service with this population, it was outdated. There was a lot of blatant misinformation, and perhaps it was also problematic. And so, like I said, this was a qualitative study. It was about 24 individuals who reported in interviews about the nuances of working with LGBT plus individuals at risk of trafficking. I'm going to pause here because we've got a question. And also just catch my breath for a moment. So the question states, out of curiosity, why do you think the numbers are much higher for sex trafficking for LGBTQ plus youth? I've got a few anecdotal theories about it, but I do think it's representative in the literature. I think just on from a research standpoint, because more individuals are identifying as LGBTQ plus, I think that just by virtue makes the numbers a little bit higher, right? So it's more likely that they're the ones on who are reporting homelessness. There are more of them than there is their cisgender counterparts. So, you know, just from a number standpoint, right? Like we're going to pick up more on things that are going on with them because they're overrepresented. Now, with that said, I'll go and kind of speak from clinical experience. I think, unfortunately, that there's still a lot of forcing out, kicking out, removing, even people on their own accord, choosing to leave situations that are very harmful. So you're kind of predicting my session a little bit today, because if they're leaving home because it's terrible, right? They're willing to make this risk of potentially being in a situation where they don't have a stable housing situation. I also think in my work, in particular with gender diverse individuals, and actually had a case study prep today if we got to. It's not in the PowerPoint because I didn't know if we'd have time, but what I saw a lot in my clinical experience with trans folks is sometimes they were using survival sex to get access to things that they could not get access to if they were in their original housing situation. And what I mean by that, and I had a couple of young people where this absolutely hands down was the case, is like, well, I can, you know, my parents won't give me money because I want to buy, you know, this certain type of clothing. But I can make some money and buy the clothing that I want. And sometimes survival sex was a use of that. So that's anecdotal. That's not every case, but hopefully there are just some examples that answer your question, that eliminate the risk of sex trafficking. And feel free to respond back to that. All right. And so I talked about this 10 years ago, and I just kind of shared this in the example. I used to say there are kind of three moving parts to this. And like I said, this question kind of dictated where I was going. Survival sex, trauma, and homelessness was sort of the moving parts that had a lot to do with how I looked at working with a homeless individual or a homeless LGBTQ individual. They're just these sort of situations that kind of like fed off of each other. And so for me, if I was talking about working with a young LGBTQ plus person, I was going to be thinking about these three moving parts, especially clinically, especially if it wasn't in the referral, especially if I didn't have any information of where the referral was coming from, or especially if this person was involved in some state system of care. And what kind of looking at the research today and where I've moved to is, we've got more of a bigger sociological system and issue going on. And so you'll see the original three moving parts, but I've added here that social media, technology, and the current socio-political climate definitely is a big piece of this picture that should not be neglected. And so when I say examining the structural systems, this is what I'm talking about. Sort of, we've got to understand how these different layers really impact the experience of posing increased risk for trafficking. And so imagine you've got sort of a history of some sort of juvenile justice or child welfare involvement, right? And this is kind of me moving up when talking about work with adults. If you've got this history and then now you're encountering less economic opportunities, right? Because there is a lot of bias and discrimination in work, employment settings, the housing market, and also healthcare. And so now we've got to think across micro, meso, and macro levels, like how this all impacts. And I think this speaks to the question that was just asked. This all impacts trafficking situations. And I know my presentation is just focused on sex trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, but I also need to note that it's also labor trafficking as well. And so coming back to that socio-ecological system, perhaps maybe this is, I'm a visual person. Maybe this is a visual that might capture how these experiences build on each other, perpetuate the same concerns, they overlap, but I'll also share they exponentially sort of increase perhaps that susceptibility or the margins, right? For LGBTQ plus individuals. And so these are all pieces of the picture that I'm making a rationale for examining. We've got to look at these pieces because they are interacting on many different levels for these individuals. All right. And so this is kind of just what I shared a little bit, but it's important to kind of note the marginalization. Issues of trauma, and I think as providers, we see them as trauma. I want to be very clear that sometimes LGBTQ folks do not. There's also a particular criminalization of individuals. There should be a bullet point here. Medical care, bans and restrictions, how they're impacting LGBTQ plus individuals right now. That's the added piece of the pie, the socio-political climate that I'm acknowledging. And then also, in what ways technology becomes a conduit, right? So, gosh, when I was first doing this, I don't think Uber was around. Um, and that's not to say there wasn't ways where like picking up a person, didn't happen, but I'm just aware of like how technology has kind of effectively sped up a lot of concerns around trafficking and apps and social media. All right. And so I'm not gonna, especially looking at the time, I'm gonna go into all of this because I know that we see it, right? Like there's a persistent dehumanization of LGBTQ plus identities that shows up in a lot of ways. I do want to acknowledge that there is there can be a process of internalization around this, and what I'll point to is stigma, shame, and guilt that all impacts people's experience, right? There is a prevalence of trauma. There's concerns around economic stability. And then we also still have a lack of culturally appropriate and accessible resources, right? I think sometimes I was always doing research on the type of referrals I would make because I would want to make sure that agency or that system wasn't going to perpetuate the harm that was already being reported in front of me. So this marginalization can show up in trauma. I won't define trauma because I am going to presume that we all know and are on have some definition to that. But I will share, there's a way that this manifests. I'm aware of boundaries and how that impacts choices. Financially, it really does. If you are learning about money through exchanges of problematic power, right? That's going to affect your financial literacy, well-being, and your boundaries. I've shared and talked about internalized stigma. In research, we talk about minority stress. And so just to share a little bit more, minority stress is different than typical stress, right? Minority stress theory acknowledges that the burden of bias and prejudice exacerbates typical stress. And so this theory was researched in actually sexual minority individuals and gender minority individuals now. And so it's sort of speaking to the additional burden and the additional exacerbation of just everyday stress that is particular for those folks who might identify with minority identities. And so it is a unique experience that is different than those who experience typical stress in the majority. We also see the impact and the crossover with dating violence and unhealthy relationships. And then, of course, there's been a lot of underreporting of assaults and hate crimes. I think there's more awareness to it now, but there's still a lot that we don't know. It's one of the reasons why I'm in research, because I want to do research in an ethical way to understand stories from this population. But I'm aware that there are a lot of individuals who don't want to participate in research because of the harmful practices of it. So it's been hard to gather and collect accurate info. I will share that it's majority of times always approximate. Additionally, I really want to be very, very careful here, Because what can happen, and I saw this a lot in Georgia. I'm hopeful it might not be the case in Maryland. Um, but it's important that we don't equate past trauma, past abuse with sexual orientation and gender identity. I cannot tell you the amount of providers, to be honest, but also other collaterals, and I think it comes from an antiquated point of view. It comes from ignorance. It comes from also bias, that, oh, well, if you weren't trans, then this wouldn't happen to you, right? Or if you weren't gay, then you wouldn't be taken advantage of. Again, I'm speaking from my experience of working in Georgia, but I do want to always share this point that trauma does not equate to someone's identity. Trauma is something that happens, and it is on providers to piece apart and process how that event or that situation might impact the development of someone's identity, right? So I'm not saying that there might not be questions there. I just want to note that sometimes it's complicated, and people really do have to, um, be able to tease out what has happened based on life and circumstance, and understand that in the context of who they might be. So there is a lot of research. I think more so coming recently, but I want to take a moment to tease this out a little bit, because there is also over representation, a disproportionate amount of, and I'm going to speak from the standpoint of youth and young adults. And when I say that, I'm meaning 14, 15-ish up to 26, 27, 28-ish. Okay. But a disproportionate amount of individuals are detained and arrested for what I call, and what's been also termed as survival crimes. I had a lot of young people who were detained and harassed. And part of it was like they were in the store and they had no money, and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna take this bag of chips because I'm hungry. I haven't eaten in a couple of days, right? I saw this a lot in Massachusetts. Was reported a lot in Georgia. I think this is, again, something that's coming out more. And we're also seeing this in bills now, where it's like, what are those petty theft, those petty crime misdemeanors that have been attached to cases when people are maybe loitering, trespassing, maybe they're just hanging out there because they don't have anywhere else to go. But then they become suspected victims of, a sex crime, but there's still these charges that they pick up and get linked to, based on, the whole circumstance just has to do with maybe they're just hanging out in that place because it's away from the trafficker, right? Or it's away from somewhere else that's not safe. I also had a lot of individuals who would end up with assault charges. And, the whole instance was actually they were being harassed, but they end up getting picked up because they're defending themselves in a fight, and it's a public nuisance, disorderly conduct charge. And then there was a fair amount of individuals who would be charged with solicitation. And what wasn't seen is that this person was actually, uh, their trafficker was not too far. They've been asked to, go be over here and work that corner, but they've been picked up on a charge of solicitation, and they don't, the whole picture isn't seen no matter what they're saying. The exploitation is not picked up on. There's a misidentification of what's really going on. And then further, when this person is committed, they're unsafely confined or isolated, right? And I would see this with gender diverse individuals. Oh, we don't know what to do or where to put you. Again, binary systems. So we'll just isolate. We'll put you in confinement here because I guess that's the safest place to be. And so imagine the trauma and the things that might go on, when this person is isolated away. Also had a lot of reports of probation. And again, I'm going to speak to Georgia specifically because it was in my time of working there where people were mandated to conversion therapy. Still, to my knowledge, not outlawed in Georgia, even though it might be in other places. And then also imagine being held because there's minimal to no family involvement. So now, we might be in a juvenile justice situation that crosses over with child welfare. And so the charges and records, right? Because this has impact. What happens later, this goes back to speaking about housing and employment discrimination. You now can't apply for housing because, you've got, not only housing, and it might be like joint housing, right? Or you can't apply for a job because you've got pending charges or something coming up on a background check. So like I said, speaking back to that sort of ecological system, right? Like the things end up compounding, and the factors sort of become bigger, even though they might be based on something maybe that was a little bit ago. And here is actually where I'm hopeful to invite a couple of comments and maybe questions and voices, because the impact of gender affirming care, I would say in medical concerns, it's not a new issue, but I'm aware that it's perhaps a gap in the literature. So what I'm going to share with you is sort of anecdotally from my clinical work, and again, maybe how I'm thinking of my research interests in advocating on behalf of this population. But I am kind of wondering about how what the impact of gender affirming care restrictions and bans might have on human trafficking risk and involvement. And so, just to give you a little bit of background, in 2024, we've seen about 597 bills introduced. And mind you, about 200 or so have been carried over from the previous year and perhaps the year before. But these bills are introduced to limit healthcare, education, legal recognition, and protection. And what we know is there are 42 bills that are now laws across 43 states. That is significant. So what I am kind of curious about is we might have individuals who do not have access to medical care, who might use the street as a market for many things. So if you're in a state that has banned access to hormone replacement therapy, and you now are turning to a market on the street that is actually, it's less likely for it to be hormones, and more likely to be silicone. I'm going to speak in reference to trans women for a moment. Looking for quick feminization processes, there's a lot of silicone exchanged on the street. So imagine making this decision because there's no access to medical care. And I'm also mindful, and I shared this a little bit of in the example before, survival sex can sometimes be equated with a pathway to transition. And I share it in that way as it has come across to me in my clinical experience for gender diverse folks, right? So you get denied access to medical care, and now, you know, I'm going to turn to a means of money, a means of some type of monetary value so that I can, again, express my gender in a way that happens. So again, this kind of goes back to the question that was asked earlier. But I wanna pause here, and I'm hopeful I might get a little bit of participation. I don't want to talk at you for the whole afternoon, but how might gender affirming care bans and restrictions for youth and young adults impact risk of human trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation, DMST? And I want to pose it really as a discussion because the research is limited. I think we're at a cross point, we're at a crossroads here. And there might be some important things to figure out, but I'm curious how you all are sitting with this, how you all are sitting with a lot of this information. But what do you think? I think I see one comment. They may not be able to tell a provider about the trafficking if they don't have access to medical care. That is absolutely true. I was actually one of the studies I was looking at actually was making a case for the research question was like, how do we help young people access care, but also provide the necessary information, you know, in medical care in order to be able to be identified and get treatment and kind of talk about trafficking experiences. So this was a study that actually involved young people. It was community-based participatory research, and so there were some young people that helped craft the questions and asking and surveying other young people to understand, um, you know, how can we get providers really asking the questions and get young people to talk about it. Oh, lovely. We've got some more comments. Um, See if I can keep up. I think abusers and traffickers can use this need as a method of control for their victims and a way to continue exploitation. Absolutely. If they're needing to travel to other states to try and access gender affirming care, another pressure. Yeah, absolutely. To try to access money and resources. I think there is a general lack of understanding that they are in a human trafficking situation. They're thinking of survival, yes, not whether a person is breaking the law while they are surviving. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Another one, I think abusers and traffickers can use this as a method of control. Yep. While we do not have a law banning gender affirming surgeries for youth in Maryland at this point, I agree. I don't think so either, to my knowledge. What I am seeing among clients is an inability to access gender affirming surgeries for teens under 18. Yes, absolutely, because of hospital policies that are not offering the surgeries because of liability issues. Yep. So this is de facto a ban, especially with clients that are using, I'm going to assume that's Medicaid, MA for insurance, public insurance, using MA. Not everyone who presents themselves as a trusted queer peer adult is a safe adult. A potential trafficking could recognize this vulnerability as a means to exploit an already isolated and exploited youth. Yeah. So this is, I mean, I felt like I really had to cut myself off because much of these comments I totally agree. I was thinking about, right now we have a host. Um, I'm still involved with the network of providers in Georgia, and much of them have actually been talking about how families are just leaving, like they're uprooting and leaving states like Florida, Georgia, Mississippi. I think Tennessee is one, and going to areas where they're larger urban areas, they're bigger cities, perhaps more progressive, left leaning, and fleeing for sanctuary, for safety, right? And one of my thoughts about that is like, yes, I don't want folks to be in an unsafe situation. And I'm also aware that that's going to burden a system in an area, right, that might already also have a number of weights or bills, that might be on the docket. So I am really concerned about this impact and perhaps how it might intersect with issues of trafficking. And then especially to the person that said that, while there's not a ban that exists, right, there are these processes that are like de facto bans because they're limiting something, right? That is absolutely 1000% one of the things I was thinking about in compiling this slide. And we have, I don't think I missed any other thoughts. These were wonderful comments. What are the average age? This was a question. What are the average age of young girls trafficking? I'm not going to misquote a statistic. I will share from my experience in the places I've worked on trafficking. So Georgia, Massachusetts. I Assuming across my caseload and consultation and supervision, 13 is the youngest in my own clinical experience. That might not be representative across the nation or in other areas, or maybe even here. I think it might be prudent to think, in addition to age, that there are a number of other factors that are risks and things to analyze in trafficking. So it might not solely be isolated to age. I think that there are a lot of other concerns in addition to someone's age that might pose more risk and concerns for trafficking situations. All right. And I am hopeful to keep us chatting here. And I want to think about really the impact of the internet. When we think about social media and technology, I think, it's interesting. I would always share with my clients, for anyone who is sort of in a transition, whether that was like, just sort of changing pronouns or considering medical interventions, changing documentation, right? Like, I'd sort of say like the internet is a blessing and a curse. There are ways that you might explore the internet looking for community, support, rules and procedures about, changing your name on your social security card, right? Where the internet is helpful. And it is very, very, very quick and easy, unfortunately, to fall down the wrong rabbit hole. And the internet becomes a significant source of harassment, you know, rhetoric, demeaning information. And, you know, I've said here, you know, that there are some real predatory outlets out there. And I think, uh, you know, unfortunately, traffickers are very savvy. And that's why I say, you know, it's not always third party involvement. It is not always, commonly people will say pimp. I will encourage you to use the word trafficker because pimp has a certain connotation, a certain racial connotation to it. And some people don't have pimps. In fact, I rarely had a young person who would say they had a pimp. But there are a lot of predatory outlets in which traffickers have become very savvy at recruiting and grooming. And, you know, unfortunately, it can affect a person who might be sort of feeling isolated or alone and looking for a source of connection. You know, I think where perhaps Instagram and TikTok have been very helpful is like there are a lot of um, people who are visibly trans in other places or visibly queer or gay, bi in other places, and they talk about their experience. And that's a source of connection. It's a source of support. You know, for someone who could be in a very rural, you know, small area, that's something we would want to support. Like, yes, find what you need, find a story that you can relate to. You know, I can actually remember talking with some trans clients around like makeup. You know, there's a lot of makeup tutorials and people who can build things with makeup. And, you know, that for a, you know, young, maybe earlier in a medical intervention process, you know, a person who's transitioning, like that could work, be wonders for them, you know. So I spend a lot of time on this because it's a perplexing issue. That something that could be so supportive can also be so dangerous, you know. And as a parent myself, I'm like, um, man, I'm like, I don't know. The internet is wild. There are a lot of ways that as a parent, I've become concerned about the internet where I just, you know, thought it was great before. Um, and so I do want to be clear too that there are some mixed reviews, you know, I think on how we mitigate concerns with the internet and social media in particular. I've worked with families who, you know, want to be pretty strict about use and surveillance, and that's tricky. You know, when you're working with a teenager, you know, working on things like boundaries and limits and choices, sometimes surveillance can really perpetuate some issues around trust of that nature. So, um, you know, I want to throw all of this out there because, you know, really I have some questions. You know, how should we be working with clients around the internet and social media access? And, you know, what are this? I haven't shared an exhaustive list, but I'm curious what you all feel are, you know, additional risks and benefits of technology. You know, especially when we have you know, pandemics and things of that nature. So when we're looking for sources of support and connection, you know, it can be a slippery slope. But all right, we've got some comments coming in. Oh yes, please. There was a comment share. Yes, if it seems like I covered your question or just touched maybe part of it and it still didn't answer, please do. Please let me know. But we've got a comment: empowering young people to be safe online is key. not taking it away, because they will find a way, absolutely. And that's sort of my rule as a parent too. Like if it might not happen in our house, it can happen in someone else's. So yeah, that's a good point. And I'll take this to say too, as much as it is, uh, young people, maybe younger adolescents, I also want to share that uh, with I'm using quotes because it's like chronologically aged adults. So like even those folks who are like 19, 20, 21, right? Like by law, they're adults, right? But when you have experiences where you have not had as many supports, sometimes that might impact you developmentally too. So someone who's presenting and they are looking very much older, their sources of connection might be coming from this is I'm putting my clinical hat on here, coming from places that might be younger developmentally. So when an adult can be engaging on the internet, there's still some things we have to think about too. Yes, frontal lobe is still in development until 25. I say 29 sometimes, and I'm 39, so I will say sometimes I feel like my frontal lobe is still developing. Um, but yes, it's important that even when we're working with our adult age clients, that we are thinking about how they might be engaging in the world on the internet too. So it is still about uh, how we communicate, how we help them to negotiate maybe situations and making choices, right? This is still very important for adult age folks. Any other thoughts on technology? Because I'm aware, uh, if you look at resources like National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, even other national resources, there's a lot of talk around technology, being aware of apps and all of this. So I think this is a very important conversation when we're talking about trafficking. We have to be talking about technology. We have to evolve with technology. Any other thoughts? Thank you for saying gaming, because that was actually a thought in my mind. So, and I wanted to expand on. So, a lot of older, not to generalize, but I do want to point this out. A lot of older trans women in particular have found a great deal of community and support through gaming. And I have so much to say about this. You could look at this in a lot of different ways of sort of like socialization, how you might want to help someone increase other outlets of socialization and support. I know there's a lot about addiction and gaming use now, gaming too much, glued to the screen type things as well. But there is a lot of community, I will say, that some people have found through gaming. And I'm not gonna lie, I think that is one of my worries, is that this setting, this support for one person might become a ground of exploitation. Um, I am, again, we have to think that people are very smart. They find ways to do things they shouldn't be doing. And I would hate for the community of support that's really been established through gaming and some gaming sites, I would hate for that to be targeted, because it has been a real support for some people. So I'm glad you brought that back up, because actually on the tail end of my last comment, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned gaming, because it is a big community, especially for those individuals who are, experiencing more social anxiety, perhaps, in a place of, feeling uncertainty, unsure, really questioning. There's something about being able to sit and audibly connect, right? And talk about who you are, but you're not necessarily seen. That is a big protective factor. Also, language. Social media allows for a short turn around for language change. I try to be intentional about trying to keep up with the constantly changing language to be able to relate to clients without them feeling like they're in a role of educating the counselor and ultimately feeling misunderstood. Also, how much we can miss if we don't know some common language and terminology. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important comment maybe for me to share. Like the social meaning and the context of words changes. In my prep for this, as I shared with you, queer has become established in my vocabulary because of who I was working with and me adapting to the language of the community I was serving. And I'm aware that that word has the social meaning, the context of that word has evolved over time. So yeah, it's incredibly important. I would make kind of jokes with my clients of like, what are some things I don't know now? And especially as visibly the more older I got, the more gray hair I got. It became sort of a source of connection for me to laugh with my clients about maybe some of the things some words I didn't know. Um, all right. You also have kids and adults on the gaming sites. Yes. And so absolutely. It's like I said, such a uh, right now what feels like a perhaps depending on how you look at it, protective outlet environment right now. But it's true that adults are on the gaming sites, and I do. I'm saying like older trans women, but it's like there are a lot of young people on gaming sites. There are a lot of early age adolescents on gaming sites. So that's very true. Okay. Thank you all. I'm noting the time. I wanted to leave a bit of open space for questions. So I'm going to move us forward. So when I talk about crafting a unique response, I'm going to look at this again through social workers. So looking at this through the levels. You know, at the micro level, I think a lot about individual mental health treatment. I feel like that is a known. But what I want to share here is that sometimes therapeutic treatment is important. And so therapeutic treatment is different from therapy. So there are other social supports that have a therapeutic setting that are important for this population. And sometimes I say, uh, you all might have heard this too, where it's like LGBTQ folks are like therapied out because it's like, we've been told to go to therapy to talk about who we are, or maybe I had a number of folks who felt like they didn't need therapy, right? So, what are the other therapeutic supports that might be helpful? But in terms of mental health treatment, I do think about evidence-based and evidence-informed interventions. And what we know, and in fact, I have been a part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, NCTSN, for several years now. And while they talk a lot about trauma treatments, one of my first introductions to trauma treatment was TFCBT. And I do believe I think as I'm coming to learn Maryland a little bit more, there's a lot of focus on TFCBT as well. So trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. I mentioned that in particular because I actually had a chance to work with Dr. Kelly Kanish, but there is a paper I'm going to make sure to include on the references, but it talks about TFCBT and working with LGBTQ youth of color. So sometimes it's kind of it can be rare that you might see specific interventions that have been researched in populations of color, but I wanted to mention TFCBT because there is some concrete support around that and working with individuals of color. I also want to empower us to think from a standpoint of harm reduction and utilizing motivational interviewing techniques. In my work with adolescents, but really young adults, so I'm going to say 17 to about 21, 22. If you've worked with this population, you know, they're coming into their own, they're coming into their identity. And so sometimes as providers, we might share something that they might not necessarily agree with, or maybe they've been in therapy for so long that it does feel like it doesn't work, right? So we have to engage these approaches that might come from a standpoint of meeting people where they're at, you know. When I make a decision, I go through all sorts of stages of change here, you know. You don't just go out and buy a mortgage tomorrow, right? You might be in a pre-contemplative stage of it. I don't know about these interest rates, these prices, where this house is located versus this, is this long term, right? Like we go through a process around making decisions so that they're informed decisions. I want us to think about providing that environment that invites clients in to say, you know, I think someone alluded to this before. I wasn't thinking that I was being trafficked. I just thought this was a person who cared for me, you know. So we can't come right out and say, this is trauma, you're being trafficked, let's work on this. I also want to think about, you know, how do we think about assessment? You know, there's sort of like the formal intakes, the formal questions you can ask, but for me, if we're not working from an intersectional lens of identities and working with an approach of cultural humility, sometimes we don't pick up on the all the information we need that might be in these assessments. So we've got to like blend ways to think about how we ask questions so that we can obtain the information where we can start to work from and build a foundation to approach response at this level. And so I've mentioned my life, my choice here. Many years ago, this is sort of a model that has been worked from for essentially kind of mentorships and therapeutic support in their survivors. So survivors are now mentors and engaging with, at the time when I was introduced to them, it was, I think still is, all girls. I've continued to do work with the organization, but I wanted to mention it as a resource and maybe a point to look up, as I think Lisa Goldblatt Grace has nationally kind of talked about their model of working with young girls and sexually exploited youth. All right, and when we're thinking meso, I often times I think sometimes we don't know about sort of the coordinated responses and the multidisciplinary teams and collateral supports, the community efforts that are there. And so I encourage people to seek out what, you know, I come from Georgia, where we actually established CSEC MDT. So these were all of the cases that identified youth that were at risk of trafficking, and they actually were identified through child advocacy centers. And so this was a specialized MDT for the Atlanta metro area. But we had all these collaterals represented, you know, so we had legal, sometimes we had law enforcement, we had attorneys, we had medical folks there. other clinical folks. We also had educational supports. We had community. So if they had a coach or a mentor, those folks were a part of the team. And so I think it's important. I know, there's the Maryland Trafficking Task Force. It's important to be involved in whatever county and state level, uh, um, state-led task force there are. And then just being aware of other community-based non-governmental agencies that might have wraparound programs. And I'd say if their model, doesn't include sort of how to identify or how we work with anyone at risk of trafficking, it's important to think about that. So I have worked in both drop-in center models and federally qualified health centers. And so I like to think about how, in a drop-in center, you just have folks walking in and through an intake or through conversation, you can identify sort of what's needed. With the FUHC, using that kind of approach, think about what services you might wrap around in that community-based setting. It is important that they involved housing, employment, not just individual modalities, but also group and peer support. And so I'm sure some of y'all are aware of Chase Brexton, my training in Massachusetts. I worked with Fenway Health Center. And actually they developed a training institute, and they do a lot of, at least the time that I was in Massachusetts, they were doing a lot of training on sexual exploitation and trafficking and survival sex in particular. Let me pause for a moment. I think I see a new comment. Supporting safe online activity by providing resources to learn how to be safe and how to report. NCMEC, yep, take it down. And we've also got a comment. I like the idea of meeting folks where they're at. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about bottom-up approaches. Yeah, somatic experiences, mindfulness, EMDR. I imagine it can be difficult to be in the throes of cognitive dissonance or in the muck of coercion and gaslighting to see things clearly, though rational thinking. Yes. Disassociation might also prevent awareness about their situation as well, which is why I ask about modalities that focus on the body. I appreciate you bringing this up, and I think I've kind of been speaking from a top-down approach, head approach, research approach. What I think can be helpful, and we see this a little bit in TFCBT, but not so much. Self-regulation, emotion regulation is really important. Of course, in trauma treatment, we can't process trauma if we're not sort of regulated to be able to engage the rational brain, right? So I see bottom-up approaches at, for someone who might be highly symptomatic or might have been involved in treatment for a long time. I think bottom approaches are very helpful in providing a sense of regulation and really helping someone, for lack of better words, be in better control. But what I mean is start learning, right, what their body is saying and what is happening in order to feel a sense of self-control, right? Because in trafficking situations, it's the opposite. So I think bottom up can do a lot for just bringing someone into a space to be able to start to work on things that are going to be of the rational mind that needs to engage the rational brain. You can't do anything, any higher function processing, or even talk about boundaries, right, if we're not regulated. So thank you. I appreciate that comment. Very good point. I think another, yes, thank you. All right. How are we doing? Oh, we're doing good. All right. And what I want to think about macro, because I think this is where the muck occurs. And I'll share transparently. I felt I was doing a lot of therapy, and I just kept coming into contact with like structural issues. And while yes, we talked about and certainly brought in and would engage these conversations around power and privilege, I felt like something was missing. And so I wanted to go back to school because I wanted to think about research differently, and I wanted to do some research to think about what are the structural issues that really impact um, this. we can talk about um, we can talk about those who experience trafficking all day, but if we don't acknowledge the systems that are interplaying to reinforce and perpetuating the situations of trafficking, to me, we're only hitting half of the picture, and not even half, because I think this has the majority of the issue in it. So I guess I share this for those who are interested in school or interested in seeking other learning about other disciplines, other certifications, other frameworks to work from, other theories to practice from, other methods and modalities, right? I think we have to re-envision. This is kind of just the question that was asked, right? Like, how do we think about bottom up? How do we think about the larger perspective in different ways so that we see our clients as whole? And for me, it was about, coming back and really examining the gaps in the literature around LGBTQ plus identities, around trans and gender diverse individuals. And it's important to engage in ethically appropriate and socially just research. And so, as I shared with you, the study that talked about community-based participatory research, we can use community advisory boards. We should be asking folks who have experience of trafficking, who are LGBTQ identified, we need to be incorporating their voices and their leadership in envisioning programs, envisioning missions, your vision statements. They need to be involved. Additionally, when we work from socially just places and ethically appropriate places, we're inviting how to be more culturally humble, culturally aware, and competent, and including understudied population, right? And then lastly, this is, something to bite on, but we have to address the structural issues of racism, heteronormativity, and health inequity. I do believe this is a public health issue. And I think we have to think and really work from it in a way that examines these system issues in the sociological system in addition to the person who's experienced it. All right, perfect. I want to invite you all back in to kind of think about, how do we sustain support in this process? This by no means, I actually struggle with this slide the most because support is so individual. I also don't want to sound on par with the trend of wellness and self-care. And in fact, maybe I'll approach this from a personal standpoint. I have ebbed and flowed in clinical work. I loved residential treatment, but I knew to continue that love and passion and the same amount of 110% that I could give, I could not do it for more, than a certain amount of time. So I worked in a lot of residential settings, but it was time limited because I was aware of when I just needed that break and when I felt like I wasn't effective anymore. And so I think we've got to be honest with ourselves around, what your own individual support needs to look like. And so I mentioned here consistent supervision and consultation, whether you are 30 years deep in the field or 10 or 5. It's so important. And in fact, it is, our ethical duty as social workers to seek supervision and consultation. And I think in addition to that, it calls on us to really continually to develop our self-awareness and our cultural humility. What one day is going to be different tomorrow. And if you work with young folks, that is that much more true. Something is always changing. Additionally, we have to know our limitations within the scope of the problem. So, um, this is not news to anyone. Trafficking is not going to end tomorrow. I wish. But there are a lot of issues that go into that. And again, I've called attention to some of the structural components, but I think a part of being effective and to sustain support is to sort of know where your limitations are, work collaboratively across disciplines, and work in numbers, work with your collaterals, because I do believe it is that human connection that will propel and motivate us to keep going, especially when there are limitations there. But if we do that work in isolation, dare I say it, it's very easy to burn out. And I think additionally, when I think about trafficking in particular, there's so much legal knowledge, policy awareness, legislation, things that we have to keep up with. So that's why I say, when you can work and engage with collateral, legal folks cannot be left off. Law enforcement, it should be present. There should be some partnerships there. And, last and certainly not least, as I started with, sometimes we need to pause. We've got to step away. It was shared that this, session, this training has a heavy topic. So I implore you, after talking about this for an hour and 45 minutes, like if you need a pause, you need a pause, and step away as needed. It's very important. All right. And then close. I want to open up for some questions and just comments in general. But I've just named here, it's a bit different than your slides because I knew I was missing a couple of programs that I wanted to mention. Still learning my local resources. I've alluded to sort of being new in Maryland, but I literally just moved here last August, so I haven't been here very long. But I just wanted to offer some resources. This is not exhaustive by any means, but I do think by clicking on a couple of things will lead you to more things, will lead you to more things. I do want to shout out also the hotline through the Polaris Project. So this is for anyone, any thoughts, reports, suspicions of trafficking are welcome to use this line. And want to offer my contact information should you need. I am certainly open to hearing comments, questions, anything that I can explain further or readdress. You don't have to fit it all into this 10, 15 minutes. You can also reach out by email if that's helpful too. But I wanna hear from y'all if you have anything, and catch my breath. I do see someone's mentioned that the hotline can provide referrals to service responders. Yeah, that's good. Important to point out. Put the national hotline back. Yes. Sorry, Alyssa.
Oh, you're good. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I would also like to draw attention to the chat. I posted the anonymous evaluation link into the chat. We greatly appreciate all feedback. Additionally, if you're seeking a certificate of attendance or certificate for CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. Upon submitting the evaluation form, you'll receive access to the CEU request form, and you can expect to receive your CEU or certificate of attendance in 3 to 4 weeks. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I will be sending out a follow-up email early next week with a copy of today's recording, the PowerPoint slides, and any additional resources that Theron can provide. So thank you again for coming, and we will stick around for questions.